Forsaken in early 2025.
The sun is shining, the birds are singing, the children are playing in the village square. What a wonderful time to be alive.
Hey, we're adding a new Forsaken character. And he's hella overpowered.
What an awful time to be alive.
Okay, I'm done with this joke. So, February 2025, when Forsaken was young, unbalanced, and a pretty small game with under 20,000 players. What a time it must have been. Well, I'm saying this like I didn't start the game at this time. Forsaken was just over a month old, and the game was still in a rough alpha state, but despite this, a new survivor was in the first huge update, surprisingly soon. Dusekkar arrived in update 2.1.0, late February of 2025. Now, if you've watched my video covering the 5 most overpowered characters in Forsaken history, you already know where this is going. To put it simply, Dusekkar wasn't just the most overpowered survivor in the game's history, but fundamentally completely different from the Dusekkar we know today, and not in the way you'd expect. In this video, I will be going over the entirety history of Dusekkar, his buffs, his nerfs, his meta and placement in the game, and how he has evolved over the year. You guys seem to love the video about Jason's history, so I brought it back for a surprisingly even more interesting evolution that Dusekkar has held. So if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel as we're rapidly approaching a whopping 20,000. You guys are insane. Huge thanks to Cylonius for helping a lot with the recordings you see in the background, and if any footage is from someone other than me or him, I'll credit them in the description. So this is the full history of Dusekkar. I'm honestly surprised how I don't see people talking about how horrific of a debut this character had. Obviously, they can't hit the target every time, especially on their first new character, but still, people say that upon release, 2-time was overpowered, Taff was underpowered, Noli was broken, but nobody talks about how Dusekkar had by far the wackiest release of any character in Forsaken, by far. But first, I'm going to go ahead and explain who Dusekkar is and what he's about. Dusekkar is the 9th survivor added to Forsaken and the 3rd support character. At the time, the only other 2 characters in his league were Elliot and Bilderman, who as we all know are arguably 2 of the most powerful survivors in the game. Dusekkar had a lot to compete with, and as supports are the backbone of Forsaken as a whole, the foundation of a powerful team of survivors, Dusekkar had a lot to live up to. He was a lot more complicated than Bilderman's one-click contributions, and Elliot just being a direct healer. Dusekkar had spawn protection and ability where he casts a shield onto any survivor for 10 seconds. This shield gave survivors almost complete resistance, only taking a slap of roughly 5 damage from regular killer swings. It could be applied from a whopping, mind-boggling 275 studs away, spanning almost the entirety of any map's visible length. So roughly, he could use this from pretty much any range. And this was important because while protecting someone, Dusekkar was completely vulnerable. You could barely move. So if you're too close, the killer had nothing to lose than just redirect straight toward you for some easy damage. There were some other little gimmicks from spawn protection, such as being able to apply to a survivor on gashing wound, or how you couldn't protect someone from behind a wall for too long. This obviously made him a bit map dependent, especially with a range like this, which would make him way more effective on an open map like Yorick's, but that's the basic gist of it. Plasma Beam is his other ability, being a ray that you can cast on survivors or killers for buffs. Hitting a killer gave them pretty severe slowness for a bit, and hitting a survivor gave them both speed and overheal. Overheal is basically a temporary amount of extra health to give to a survivor that will trickle down, but it could prevent extra damage. Plasma Beam also froze you in place. You still had an incredibly healthy range of 150 studs though. You get the basic idea of Dusekkar though. He's a generally vulnerable support despite having 100 health, as his abilities freeze him in place, and he is someone to play safely and strategically. So how did this end up playing out in the main game? Dusekkar was the most overpowered character in the game's history so far, and the most unbalanced a character has ever been, despite me recording this in almost October of 2025. Think about it, an untouchable survivor who can make heavy damage abilities like Gashing Wound or Walk Speed Override useless, protect the survivor from a swing every 20 seconds, had 10 to 20 more health than other supports, and basically non-existent stacking nerfs. That is a recipe for disaster if I've ever seen one. What were they thinking? There is countless videos on the internet of lobbies filling to the brim with Dusekkars with so many spammable ranged abilities the killer literally couldn't do a thing about. Dusekkar had this absolutely insane reign of terror for roughly 3 hours. After the horrible debut, the devs scrambled to throw together an emergency nerf around 2 in the morning. This is patch 2.1.1. This patch is commonly iterated as the largest nerf in Forsaken's history. Let's go over it. First, they solidified the stacking nerfs. While I sorta glazed over it beforehand, Dusekkar's stacking nerfs went like this. If 4 or more Dusekkars are all protecting a survivor at once, all of them will be forcibly stopped and given debuffs such as blindness or weakness for a period of time. What? When are 4 different survivors being protected simultaneously? It was incredibly stupid, to the point where I didn't even bother bringing it up earlier for how irrelevant and unnecessary it was. But these nerfs, they brought that number from 4 to 3. Wow, real problem solvers. This is the only nerf that basically means nothing. I think these stacking nerfs should be scrapped altogether and maybe be tied to the amount of resistance a survivor gets from spawn protection? I don't know, but anything is better than this. Next was nerfing his health from 100 down to 90. While this isn't devastating and is seemingly a standard for supports, a health nerf is still a health nerf. Think about the amount of times you've been on 10 health or below in Forsaken, but you still stayed alive for a long period of time and was possibly even still a threat to the killer. 10 health makes quite a big difference, doesn't it? Next, spawn protection. It can no longer be applied to Gashing Wound. Damn, that one was pretty heavy. This one was basically required, however. It was stupid and made Jason borderline irrelevant without the staple ability. Plasma Beam got the biggest hits though. There's a minor one first, of Plasma Beam no longer doing anything if there's 6 or more Dusekkars present. This one is incredibly obviously just trying to prevent servers being filled to the brim with Dusekkar, but they also removed the overheal entirely. What a hit that one is, aside from the last cherry on top of severely nerfing the money and XP gained from the abilities. That is a horrific extent of the largest, most rapid emergency nerf in Forsaken's history, removing several of his core attributes, nerfing his health, and reinforcing 2 types of stacking nerfs. Wow. So where did Dusekkar go from here? I'm not gonna beat around the bush. Nowhere. That's where he went. In update 2.1.1 in March, they lightly buffed his money and XP gain back. And that's the last Dusekkar saw the face of attention for a long time. March, no changes. April, they added milestones for whoever was willing to grind out this dead character. May, he got some attention, a 3rd goddamn change to his money and XP gain. June, absolutely nothing. Okay, keep in mind that at the time, this time period with no fundamental changes was over half of the game's lifespan, majority of it actually. TAF was added, 2-time was reworked, a lot went on, and as these months trickled by, Dusekkar inevitably became by far the most underused character in the game. So was he a bad character? Maybe, we'll talk about that later. So many YouTube videos got posted basically begging the question of, remember this guy exists? He had 3 hours of glory back in February and then the devs let him to rot. We had no info on Dusekkar. This was seemingly where he'd stay for the rest of Forsaken's lifespan. June 2025 was the lowest he's ever been, and we're not exactly sure what will happen to Dusekkar until Noli, the Noli update's finally coming! July 9th, 2025, after hyping up this killer for forever, and the patch before Noli, I say in quotes, being like 1.5 months ago, promising something soon, but here we are. Noli's debut was a revelation in itself. I mean, the fact that this update took a long time sparked its own controversy in itself, but something I was probably shocked by more than anyone else in this world is when scrolling down the admittedly gigantic update log was not only a ton of new Dusekkar skins, but a full-blown rework. Oh hey, this is a quick reminder that if you enjoy this type of content, it'd be awesome if you subscribed as we close in on 20,000, which is crazy for me to even think about. Alright, back to the video. A rework is basically the idea of changing core attributes of a character and or buffing and nerfing several things. So a change can't exactly be classified as a direct buff or a direct nerf. And boy did they fit this criteria well, because this rework had an absolutely jaw-dropping roster of changes to go over. First, the foundation of the rework, the balance change that held up the new Dusekkar as a whole. You can now move while using both abilities, not move, full on sprint. This change single-handedly took this character's playstyle and strategy and flipped it on its head. This came with spawn protection having a 5-second quicker cooldown and Plasma Beam getting its overheal back. Even better than before, having a whopping 25 overheal per Plasma Beam instead of the 20 it had back in February. But for such drastic changes too, it must come repercussions. A lot of them. Spawn Protection's iconic 275 stud range would get nerfed down to a horrific 95, holding back the range of protecting a survivor a whopping 180 studs. What a nerf. Plasma Beam got it just as bad, going from the 150 studs of range down to just 80 studs. It's still alright, but completely threw the safety playstyle out the window. and it gets worse. The cooldown for Plasma Beam was hit 10 seconds higher, so it isn't even spammable anymore, even though the overheal return is likely worth it. Spawn Protection, however, saw the absolute worst of the balance changes, as the recently protected timer tied to survivors, which would prevent them from being protected constantly by Dusekkars, rose to a devastating 30 seconds. And worst of all, Spawn Protection's max duration went from an incredibly solid 10 seconds to a horrific 4.5. 4.5 seconds. These nerfs are devastating, sure. They tore Dusekkar's old identity apart and opened the door for a new era of this character. He can move, but such an overhaul to both abilities leads to a new Dusekkar, which begs the question, is this version of Dusekkar better? Now, is Dusekkar in a better spot? This question is very complicated to say the least. I put up a community post asking if you guys liked the old or the new Dusekkar playstyle better. While the results were mostly swayed toward the post-rework version of free movement, the seemingly loud minority in the comments told me otherwise. I've read all the comments, and during my interpretation, I'll put the name of the person who I took inspiration from here in the top right. So here's what I think, and feel free to comment on this topic, as I'm curious to see other people's thoughts on this messy history and bouncing of Dusekkar, and if the changes in the Noli update were the right decision. Before the change, Dusekkar was a character who had to sacrifice all of his own safety to protect another survivor. Typically from such agonizing range, it didn't affect him too much, assuming the map choice was good enough. With an entire 10 seconds of protection given every 35 seconds in the best case scenario, he was essentially a time waster for the killer. Plasma Beam was used to extend chases, and Spawn Protection would be applied at well enough times to prevent too much damage on the survivor, from whom the killer is homing in on. With short cooldowns at basically infinite range, Dusekkar's core playstyle was to keep a chase going for longer in a way where the killer essentially deals damage slower. It wasn't great. A lot of factors and thought had to go in on both sides of the equation for this to be effective. Or basically, there's a trillion ways that these interactions went wrong. The survivor runs behind a wall or toward Dusekkar. The map is a bit more cramped and abilities just can't be used as often. Or God forbid, the survivor just sucks and doesn't take advantage of the abilities you're providing. I think this is where Kaiser, the lead balancer for Forsaken, saw the problems in Dusekkar. I have played so much Dusekkar since the Noli update, and since after the rework, the addition of free movement basically guarantees that the ranges on both abilities would be severely toned down, as Dusekkar can now get up close and personal to interactions just as every other survivor does, instead of a sit on an elevated ledge far away, a playstyle criticized for being boring on both sides. Plasma Beam fundamentally just got the overheal back as a secondary buff. Survivors still also get speed nonetheless, so it's just because the guy was in need for a direct buff as well. However, the changes to spawn protection do run a bit deeper. A 5.5 second decrease in the spawn protection, a longer recently protected timer, and a slightly shorter cooldown means what? This means that spawn protection was no longer meant for a 10-second limbo to stop a chase in its tracks and pray the survivor can react in a healthy way. Now, spawn protection is intended to use in quick, extremely reaction-based bursts. See a survivor stamina hit 0? Quick, use spawn protection. Did that sentinel miss a slash, stab, punch, or gunshot? You better hope you can predict them just as well as the killer can, and you can be a lifesaver in a lot of interactions. This is why Dusekkar is classified as one of the new hardest survivors to master, and I think that this new reactionary movement and active playstyle is the best Dusekkar we've ever had. He was such an outlier, literally, before the rework with his uninteresting playstyle, but this balance change struck a perfect balance of fitting into the game fundamentally, as well as reviving the character to simply being fun. And do I think this character is fun? Well, yes, I'm actually borderline obsessed with Dusekkar now, learning the skills of other survivors, trying to predict when they slip up, thinking from the killer's eyes to guess when they use a gashing wound, a walk speed override, an entanglement, the list goes on. And that feeling when you save a survivor from a lethal hit, oh my god, is it so satisfying for both sides. In fact, the game now gives you an awesome Dusekkar skin for doing this exact action through an achievement. And this is why I think Dusekkar is the most balanced survivor in Forsaken right now. Not too good and not too bad, but also not an outlier in Forsaken's playstyle, and always a nice pick compared to other supports. Dusekkar has been perfected. So, what do you think of Dusekkar now? Leave a comment on him below. I love to read others' opinions on him. These videos I make about a character's history are some of my favorites to put together, so please let me know if you'd like to see more. And that's it for me, so I'll see you in the next one.